Eiichiro Chandran's casting in the One Piece live action has left many people unhappy for both bad reasons and one very incredibly valid reason. One group of people has said some really out-of-pocket things like calling this blackwashing or hating on the actress solely because of the color of her skin. That's the bad reason. I don't want to give any more attention to that side than I have to. The real issue that I and many other people have with this casting is that they've chosen a British Indian actress to play a character that has influence from Egyptian culture. So at the very least, an actress from SWANA, Southwest Asia and North Africa, should be playing this role. We do not have a problem with the actress herself. I don't like seeing her be attacked, especially because of the color of her skin. What we have a problem with is the string of decisions that have led to this casting choice that are indicative of a much bigger, long-standing issue. But people don't seem to understand why this is a problem or have a lot of counter arguments against this issue, so we need to discuss these with more detail and a lot more nuance. So let's start off with the first real point people use to defend this casting. Eiichiro Oda, the creator of One Piece himself, is the one that picked Eiichiro Chandran. My problem with this argument is that I don't really know why we're acting like Oda is incapable of making mistakes. If this was for the casting of Wano, which is based on Japanese culture, sure, I think it's harder to argue against his word. But the fact of the matter is, this is a Japanese writer taking elements of Egyptian and Indian culture and using that as a basis for inspiration in his story. He is 100% capable of being culturally insensitive. Speaking of, I do understand that people are using the argument that since Indian elements are also taken to help create the world of Alabasta, that Chandran's casting is fine, but I think this requires a little bit more nuance. So in the volume 17 chapter 148 SBS with Eiichiro Oda, a reader asked if there's a connection between Vivi and ancient Egypt, since Nefertari means the most beautiful, to which Oda confirmed that he was modeling Alabasta after ancient Egypt and picking out names that sounded nice. Nefertari also happens to be the name of one of the most famous Egyptian queens in history, the wife of Ramesses the Great. I want people to note that this is the only confirmed word from the author himself about where the influence for Alabasta came from. Yet I know people make the argument that Alabasta also takes influence from India. This mainly comes from Rurubu One Piece, which is a travel guide revealing possible real-world inspirations for the locations in One Piece. But it is important to note that the information in the book doesn't have any quotes or confirmations from Oda, so it seems like mainly the JTP publishing team is the one who worked on it with little to no oversight from him. That doesn't mean I'm denying that influence came from India. We'll look into it together in just a sec, but the main point is, based on the sources we possess, the intention was to mainly be influenced by Egyptian culture. Now, unfortunately, I don't own Rurubu One Piece, and even if I did, I probably wouldn't be able to read it because it's all in Japanese, but thankfully the One Piece wiki has a lot of the information cataloged in the article. I don't really like using wikis for my sources, but I don't have reason to believe this information to be incorrect, and I wanted to be transparent on where I got my information from. But regardless, the book claims that the main city of Alabasta, Alabarna, is based on the Indian city of Jodhpur, the clock tower is based on the Gantagar, and the palace is a combination of the Mehrangar and the Taj Mahal. Like I said, I'm not denying the influence here. I certainly can see the resemblance, but I have a couple of issues with using this argument to justify the casting of Chandran as Vivi. When we specifically look at the Nefertari royal family, the importance of Egyptian culture is incredibly prevalent when creating these characters. I already mentioned that Nefertari is a name associated with Egyptian royalty, but also Vivi's father, Cobra's design and clothing are very reminiscent of an Egyptian pharaoh. Pel and Chaka, the two head guards of the palace, seem to be personifications of the Egyptian gods Horus and Anubis respectively, especially with their transformations. According to the very same travel guide people like to cite, the city streets of Albarna themselves are based on Cairo, and the Tomb of the Kings, which the royal family cares for, is based on the city of Edfu in Egypt. The word poneglyph is probably a play on the word hieroglyph, and the fact that Alabasta is the first arc where we discovered the existence of one is probably not a coincidence. And the word alabasta most likely comes from a mineral used in Egyptian culture called alabaster. Heck, even one of Tutankhamun's objects in his tomb was a jar made out of this mineral. Hell, according to the Library of O'Hara, which is a fan site dedicated to collecting info including those from the Vivrekar data books, one of Vivi's favorite foods is malukia, a dish from Swana, Kobros is kanafe, a popular Arab dessert, Pels is kofta, another dish originating from Swana, and Chakas is koshari, Egypt's national dish! I don't think there'd be anything wrong with casting some Indians for the world of Alabasta at all, but when we're talking about the blend of cultures that help inspire Alabasta's creation, we have Egypt as the primary cultural source, and I'd argue sole source for the Nefertari royal family, and then we have India mainly for architecture. I feel like we're greatly exaggerating India's cultural influence and relevance to Alabasta to justify this casting. And so the fact that the One Piece live action cast Indian actors actors for the two most important characters to portray this influence of Egyptian culture in this world does a disservice to the characters in question. They didn't even try to do 50-50 like make Cobra played by a SWANA actor and Vivi by Chandran, and so I'd argue that by trying to say not casting SWANA actors at all for the royal family is perfectly fine because of some Indian architecture inspirations is just erasure of the significance of the Egyptian influence to Alabasta. People have been arguing that Alabasta is a portrayal of a mix of cultures. Well, then portray the mix of cultures. In fact, when you say that Oda handpicked Chandran, that actually makes Oda look even worse because it brings up a case of Orientalism and the assumption that Oda might just think that South Asians, Southwest Asians, and North Africans are all the same, which they are not. And if we're leading on with that too, since all Oda officially said was he based Alabasta on Egypt, does he think that India is interchangeable with Egypt when it comes to inspiration? I'm not saying he is an Orientalist, I'm just saying if you're solely using the argument that Oda picked her personally to justify this casting, you're making him look like an Orientalist because it looks like he doesn't fully understand where he's taking these real-world influences and inspirations from, saw Chandran, said India's close to Egypt, right? And moved on with his day. It is possible to make mistakes, especially when you're dealing with multiple different cultures that you're not a part of. I don't claim to be perfect either when it comes to understanding cultures, but a sensitivity and openness to it is important. But again, that runs on the assumption of Oda's involvement in the show. According to Oda, his casting selections were made over photos and videos sent to him in Japan, but I don't really know if anyone realistically expects Oda to handpick from the potentially hundreds of candidates. He doesn't have time for that. What is more likely to have happened is that the casting team narrowed it down to a few options to give Oda, which means there's a chance there wasn't even a SWANA actor or actress to be picked by Oda to begin with. I understand that actor Rob Coletti, who was playing Wapol in the live action, said that Oda hand-selected Chandran to defend her casting, but Junie Lowry Johnson and Libby Goldstein are the ones who officially are given the casting credits in the show with no mention of Oda whatsoever. Oda had a part in the casting process. I understand that, but you guys are acting like Oda had the only hand in the casting process, and that's just not true. And this transitions to a long-standing issue that has existed in Hollywood. The characters that are representative of SWANA seem to never be played by SWANA actors or actresses. In the movie The Prince of Persia, it's pretty self-explanatory where it takes place, yet they didn't cast a single SWANA actor to fit any of the main roles. Jesus in The Passion of the Christ, who historically lived in Judea, which now belongs to Palestine, is played by Jim Caviezel, who is white. Jasmine in the live-action Aladdin, which historically has been known to be a Middle Eastern tale, is played by Naomi Scott, who is of Indian descent. I know for this one, someone is probably going to go into comments and say that Aladdin is actually Chinese, since in the folktale, it's said that Aladdin is from, quote, one of the many cities in China. And without digressing too much, the characters and culture are more synonymous with the SWANA setting. Everyone's name is in Arabic, they have a sultan instead of an emperor, the incorporation of jinns in a tale, and early Arabic usage of China is known to just be the equivalent of far, far away. Saeed from the show Lost, who is supposed to be Iraqi, is played by Naveen Andrews, an Indian man. Even in Community, the character Abed is Palestinian, even though his actor, Danny Pudi, is Indian. What's even worse with this one is that the real Abed that the character is based on is in fact Palestinian, but then they changed the character to be half Polish because Pudi is half Polish. Why go that far with changing the character yet not get a SWANA actor to play him? What's that saying again? Once is a coincidence, twice is a pattern? Well then what does 6 different times really mean? Without making any accusations, it really just means that there's a long-standing precedent of giving SWANA the short end of the stick when it comes to any of the little representation opportunities they get in Hollywood. This miscasting doesn't exist in a vacuum. The One Piece live action is just another piece in a long-standing issue of miscasting characters that are supposed to be representative of SWANA. This context is important in why, again, people are upset that when presented with the opportunity to have a character that clearly has Egyptian roots to be played by at best an Egyptian actress and at worst a SWANA actress, they're instead seeing yet another South Asian person filling in for that spot. But then people have pointed out that, well, if you look at the cast of the One Piece live action, no one is really that accurate except for Makinyu, a Japanese man playing Zoro, and Lera Abova, who is Russian, playing Robin. It's important to note that the nationalities of the Straw Hats come from another SBS, but Oda himself said he didn't put too much thought into it. Quick side note, something I never really realized until now is that why does every character get a specific country like Brazil, Japan, etc., but then Usopp just gets Africa? I'm sorry, it's just weird. Why does every other character get the courtesy of an actual country to them, but then Usopp gets slapped the entire continent of Africa? But anyways, in an article with Netflix, Oda even said these were lighthearted answers, and he didn't imagine it would influence the production team so much. The nationalities of the Straw Hat characters in this case don't hold as much weight when compared to the very in-depth association of Vivi's development with her culture. Thus, it warrants getting Vivi's actress actress's nationality right, especially. But regardless, they've taken these ideas and decided that this is how they'll model their casting for One Piece. But people have pointed out that Iñaki Godoy, who plays Luffy, is Mexican, not Brazilian, Emily Rudd, who plays Nami, is American, not Swedish, and Taz Skylar, who plays Sanji, is not French. So if these characters are also not accurate, why are we not upset like we are with Vivi? Besides the deeper cultural significance for Vivi that I mentioned earlier, I do want to point out that I'm pretty sure Brazilians were also unhappy about Godoy playing Luffy, because historically, Brazil is very different from a lot of Latin America, and many don't consider themselves Hispanic because the term refers to Spanish origin, whereas Brazil is Portuguese. However, a lot of people also say that since Godoy's performance was so good anyway, that he's now an honorary Brazilian. And so there comes the argument with acting that there can be some wiggle room when it comes to a performer's nationality if their acting of the character is a better fit or done phenomenally well, and using that argument as a way to justify Chandran's casting. And you know what? Generally speaking, I do agree with the wiggle room argument. The one that I can relate to is that in Kim's Convenience, which is about a Korean family, Simu Liu, who is of Chinese descent, plays a Korean character. But in the case of Luffy, if you're not going to get a Brazilian to portray the character, I would argue that getting someone Latin American is probably the next best thing you can do. Same thing for Rudd and Skylar. If you couldn't find a Swedish and French actor for them, getting someone white I think is okay for the wiggle argument, especially if they don't as characters display any cultural background from that country. However, I only agree with this wiggle room argument to an extent. I do think that in an ideal world, we would just get actors from the correct nationality every time, but it's probably easier said than done. But we cannot use the wiggle room argument to get a British Indian actress to play a character that has Egyptian influence. That's like saying you're gonna get a half white, half Filipino actress to play a native Hawaiian in the live action Lilo and Stitch. Was that? Oh, they did do that. Well, people were upset about that too! The equivalent of giving wiggle room for these characters would be having them be portrayed by SWANA actors and actresses. And I'm having a hard time believing you couldn't find one actor and one actress descended from that entire region to play two of the most important characters representing them on one of Netflix's biggest shows. Especially when you did cast someone from SWANA in season 1. Oh wait, you made them play the bandit that kidnaps Luffy! So you can get someone from SWANA to play a villain, but not when it comes to properly representing them? Believing that India is close enough to SWANA is dangerously Orientalist because their cultures are so vastly different. There's this sentiment that for some reason people from SWANA and South Asia are interchangeable when they clearly are not, and using that to justify this casting is just perpetuating this ignorance. And so when you combine the sentiment that people from these regions are interchangeable with the fact that Hollywood perpetuates that by always giving SWANA the short end of the stick, doesn't it make sense why people are upset at this casting? Going back to Rob Coletti's statement defending Chandran's casting, he says right here that Nefertari is Egyptian and that Egypt is in the Middle East. So then why aren't we using this opportunity to open up a discussion as to why Middle Easterns are unhappy with this casting? He claims that representation matters. Well then who's being represented here? Certainly not the people that felt a strong connection to Vivi's character because of the cultural influence surrounding her. It feels like people are only going halfway with the idea of representation and not thinking about how Orientalist views of combining SWANA and South Asia into a singular idea can be seen as problematic. Again, this specific casting doesn't exist in a vacuum. This is the result of years and years of miscastings, and many of us thought we were past this in 2025. But here's an even bigger problem. With the state of the world today, in that the internet has given blatant racists, you know, the people that say that Vivi is being blackwashed, a voice in the discussion. This then divides our energy between arguing against blatant racists, which many of the cast of the One Piece live action have decided to do, and having more nuanced discussions about why we're upset with this casting. It's gotten to the point where you can't criticize Vivi's casting without getting lumped in with these other racists, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about systemic racism in one of its most visible forms, a system that has not given SWANA actors the proper opportunities to represent their own people, thus perpetuating stereotypes and Orientalism. And that brings me to one of the most important parts of this entire discussion. Why does representation matter? What does it actually do? So I want to recount my own experiences growing up as a Korean American. When I was younger, it really felt like Koreans weren't even their own people. We were just lumped together with Chinese and Japanese people, and I can't even begin to imagine what other Asians like Laotians or Indonesians felt at the time too. There's a King of the Hill joke where Hank asks Khan, "So you Chinese or Japanese?" To which Khan says he's from Laos. Hank then says again, "So you Chinese or Japanese?" I find that joke so funny and relatable because that's the kind of stuff I went through growing up in the 2000s. But you know who's a character that really put Koreans on the map? Ignoring other factors like the K-pop and K-drama industry booming, Steven Yeun playing Glenn in The Walking Dead I feel was a really big turning point as he became a fan favorite character. The only line I remember where he talks about his heritage is when he's correcting Daryl, who calls him a Chinaman, by saying he's actually Korean. That one line alone cemented a sort of validation for many Koreans living in America, as as well as putting more respect to Koreans in general too. He wasn't even specified to be Korean in the original comics, but it's a detail that seems insignificant but actually adds so much to the character for what it means for people that share a similar background. In an interview promoting the film Fences, Denzel Washington talks about how he and many other black people will know what a hot comb on their hair on a Sunday morning will smell like, and that's a cultural detail that a black audience can connect with. Being called a Chinaman while being Korean is not fun, but it's definitely a hot comb moment. Representation is not just important to the people that are being represented, it's important to break harmful stereotypes, educate the ignorant, and expose more people to more cultures in the world in one of the most direct ways possible. Going back to Daryl in The Walking Dead, later on the show when Merle calls Glenn a Chinese kid, Daryl corrects him and says he's Korean. It's little by little, but this is one of the most blatant ways to show a benefit of representation. And so I think that if you don't have a means to travel, besides food, representation in media is one of the best ways to expose people to different cultures and see them in a different light than what stereotypes might present. But that can only happen when it's done right. And that's why it was so important to get Vivi to be played by a SWANA actress, especially when you consider the political and social climate that has surrounded members of SWANA for so many years, and even more relevancy now with the humanitarian crisis affecting the Palestinians. It is so important to have a positive portrayal of SWANA now more than ever in media. Again, without digressing too much, the Egyptian identity is already so incredibly complicated because of the country's rich history of being a cultural epicenter and crossroads for many different types of people in North Africa, Southwest Asia, and even the Greeks. Obviously, I'm not Egyptian, so I'm not going to be as familiar with these issues as someone experiencing them firsthand, but there are people out there that try to say something as reductive as Egyptians are actually just black or Egyptians are actually just Greeks, when in reality it is a mix of people unified by culture. At best, casting an Egyptian would have been the perfect opportunity to show everyone, hey, even if we are different in many ways, we share a unified identity together as Egyptians. And at worst, casting a SWANA actress at least says, we recognize where historically the many different types of people that create the identity of the country of Egypt come from. Casting an Egyptian helped makes a statement against ignorant claims like Egyptians are all black, and that's just another reason why representation here is so important to get right. I understand that Alabasta is a fictional world, but the influences that are taken to create that world are so incredibly real. I feel like this word has lost some of its meaning from overuse, but when you are taking the aesthetic and cultural elements from a country to put into your story with an opportunity to give back to that very community by casting for one of Netflix's biggest shows, and you don't even give them the chance at that representation, that is just appropriation. There's no other way to say it. It is appropriation to take this culture's aesthetics and influence and not even have the courtesy to give back to that very community. And I know there are people that are gonna write off what I'm saying. They'll call me an idiot, a whiner, whatever. I don't know, maybe I just take everything too seriously. Or maybe this is a very real problem and I'm so incredibly frustrated that we're not having more nuanced discussions about this, and at the very least, understanding where people from SWANA are coming from. The entire discussion I've seen online is people from SWANA raising their concerns and frustrations, and people saying that there's no discussion to be had because Oda picked her. I get it, One Piece is fictional, but it's not really about One Piece. The live action contributes to an even bigger problem that many people face. And let's not forget that all of this arguing could have been avoided if they just casted someone from SWANA. Think of it this way, in an alternate reality where they actually did get an Egyptian actress to play Vivi, no one would be complaining that she's not being played by an Indian actress instead. And so please, I sincerely beg you to think about how it's not just a singular casting that people are upset about, but a long-standing precedent, and people are allowed to be vocal about their frustrations on it. Thank you so much guys for watching this video. I apologize if it got rambly or unorganized at points. There's so many interjections I could think of that people were gonna make, so it may have gotten a little bit jumbled up while I was making my argument. I'd love to know your thoughts on this matter, but for the sake of my mental health, I'm probably not going to look at the comments for a bit because I know there's going to be a lot of people just telling me to shut up. But if anyone, especially my wonderful viewers from SWANA or of SWANA descent, felt any type of validation from this video, then that's what's most important. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you guys next time.